This isn't a popularity contest. This isn't nostalgia. And it definitely isn't about who used to be great. Kara Lawson just forced a decision that exposes everything broken about how Team USA has been built, and someone you assumed was untouchable is suddenly on the chopping block. Pause. Breathe. Because this changes the entire conversation around USA basketball news. Here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to say out loud. Team USA has been hiding behind experience for years. Olympic cycles, familiar faces, safe choices, and every time they sell it as chemistry. But chemistry without dominance is just comfort. And comfort doesn't win forever. Now imagine being in that room. No cameras, no fans, just coaches, scouts, data sheets. Kara Lawson at the center. And one question on the table that makes everyone nervous. Who does not deserve a jersey right now? That's the question that detonated everything. Because once you stop asking who should make Team USA and start asking who shouldn't, the sacred cows start falling fast. This isn't fan talk anymore. This is philosophical warfare inside USA basketball. Let's be clear. The new blueprint isn't subtle. It's ruthless. Current performance over legacy. Future dominance over past medals. Fit over fame. And that's why Caitlin Clark isn't a debate. She's a baseline. You don't build around her hype. You build around her production. Elite vision. Elite range. Immediate gravity. She warps defenses the moment she crosses half court. Ignore that and you're not protecting Team USA, you're sabotaging it. But here's where things get dangerous. Because once Clark is locked in, the math changes. You don't need 6 guards. You don't need redundancy. You need balance. And suddenly, names that once felt automatic aren't. Jackie Young? Two-way certainty. No argument. Kelsey Plum? Proven under Olympic pressure. Fine. Paige Buchers? Ceiling too high to ignore, even with injury risk. That's 4 guards. Full stop. Now ask yourself the question nobody wants to answer. Why are we still pretending there's room for more? This is where veterans start sweating. Because USA basketball has always rewarded loyalty. But loyalty doesn't defend pick and rolls. Loyalty doesn't space the floor. Loyalty doesn't stop a younger, faster, hungrier team from exposing you on the world stage. And Kara Lawson knows this. She's not cutting players. She's cutting assumptions. And once you accept that, the roster stops being sentimental and starts being surgical. Wings matter. Size matters. Versatility matters. The game has changed, and Team USA can either evolve or get embarrassed trying to protect egos. But here's the twist. The biggest cut isn't about a name. It's about an idea. The most dangerous lie in USA basketball isn't about talent. It's about experience. And Kara Lawson just ripped that lie apart in one ruthless decision. For decades, Team USA has operated on an unspoken rule. Once you're in, you stay in. Olympic gold buys you immunity. Prior cycles buy you patience. Veterans don't compete for spots, they inherit them. And that system worked when the rest of the world was 10 years behind. That gap is gone. Here's what nobody wants to admit in current USA basketball news. International teams are younger, faster, and built around modern spacing. They don't care about your medals from 2016. They care if you can defend in space right now. This is why Kara Lawson's approach feels shocking, but it's actually overdue. Look at the guard rotation again. Clark, Young, Plum, Buchers. That's not a suggestion. That's a closed door. 4 guards means 0 wiggle room. No ceremonial roster spots. No locker room presence arguments. If you're a guard and you're not clearly better than one of those 4 today, not 5 years ago, you're out. And this is where the panic starts. Because historically, Team USA would stack guards. Too many of them. Redundant skill sets. Ball-dominant players stepping on each other's strengths. Meanwhile, wings and bigs get treated like accessories. That imbalance has cost them rhythm, spacing, and defensive versatility. Lawson flipped that logic. She didn't ask, who's earned this? She asked, who actually fits this version of basketball? And that question is brutal. Because when you prioritize fit, chemistry stops being nostalgia and starts being math. Who defends multiple positions? Who runs without the ball? Who doesn't need touches to stay locked in? Who can survive switches against elite international forwards? That's why wings suddenly matter more than ever. It's why players like Kalia Copper become non-negotiable. Relentless motor. Physical defense. No ego. No hesitation. She doesn't need a system, she is the system glue. And when you commit to that identity, something uncomfortable happens. Veteran guards, especially ones returning from injury or declining athleticism, stop looking safe. They start looking slow. They start looking exploitable. And in international play, exploitable equals hunted. This is exactly what happened in Paris. Fans saw it. Analysts danced around it. USA Basketball ignored it. Chelsea Gray making that roster while Caitlin Clark stayed home wasn't just controversial. It was symbolic. It screamed, "We value comfort over dominance." Lawson heard that message loud and clear. And she rejected it. This isn't about disrespecting legends. It's about refusing to let legacy block progress. Because the moment Team USA stops evolving, they become just another team with a famous logo. But here's the real bombshell. Once you accept that guards are capped at 4 and wings and bigs take priority, there's a specific category of player that suddenly becomes expendable, and it includes names fans assume are untouchable. Because she's already made the call. The cuts aren't random. They're targeted. And if you fall into this category, your resume doesn't matter anymore. Here's the hard reality inside USA Basketball news that fans keep dodging. The most endangered players on Team USA aren't rookies. They aren't fringe talents. They're the middle zone veterans, good enough to feel safe, not dominant enough to be essential. That's the danger zone Kara Lawson is attacking. These are players who benefited from timing. From being solid when the talent pool was thinner. From fitting older systems built on post-play, slow rotations and predictable sets. In domestic play they still look fine. But international basketball doesn't expose your strengths, it hunts your weaknesses. And Lawson knows exactly where those weaknesses live. Can you defend in space for 30 straight possessions? Can you switch onto guards without fouling? Can you score without the offense bending around you? Can you sit for 8 minutes and still impact the game? If the answer to any of those is not really, you're in trouble. This is why the conversation isn't actually about star power. It's about replaceability. If 2 players give you the same thing, you keep the younger, faster, more versatile one. Period. Olympic experience doesn't beat athletic decline. And that's why the emotional arguments don't work anymore. Fans say, "But she's been there before." Coaches now respond, "So has the film." Because film doesn't lie. Film shows who gets hunted in pick and rolls. Film shows who can't recover on closeouts. Film shows who needs the ball to stay engaged. And in a tournament where one bad matchup can cost gold, sentimentality is a liability. This is where Lawson's philosophy gets cold and effective. She isn't building a roster for comfort. She's building one for survivability. International opponents don't care who you are. They care who they can attack. And the moment Team USA protects a weak link for political reasons, they hand their rivals a blueprint. That's why bigs matter differently now. You don't just need size. You need mobility. You need someone who can hedge, recover, and still protect the rim. Someone like Aaliyah Boston becomes critical, not because she's traditional, but because she's adaptable. She anchors without clogging. She finishes without demanding touches. And when you prioritize that, slower, one-dimensional post players suddenly look outdated. This is the part fans don't want to hear. Some cuts will feel wrong. Some names will feel disrespectful. But none of them will be accidental. Lawson isn't guessing. She's optimizing. And once you see the roster through that lens, the outrage starts to make sense. Because the people yelling the loudest are defending roles that no longer exist. But here's the twist that changes everything. There's one specific player archetype that fans assume is safe because of reputation alone, and they're about to be blindsided when that assumption collapses. In Part 4, we're going to name that archetype, explain why it's quietly killing Team USA's flexibility, and why Kara Lawson is prepared to cut it loose no matter how ugly the reaction gets. The player everyone thinks is safe is actually the biggest problem, and Kara Lawson knows it. Here's the archetype that's quietly sabotaged Team USA for years. The high-usage, low-flexibility veteran. The player who needs the ball to matter. The player who slows the offense to feel comfortable. The player whose reputation outweighs their adaptability. In today's USA Basketball news, that archetype is radioactive. International basketball punishes predictability. You don't get 82 games to work things out. You get single elimination pressure, compact scouting, and opponents who game plan for your habits, not your highlights. And that's where these veterans get exposed. They're brilliant when the system bends around them. They struggle when they have to bend for the system. Kara Lawson isn't building a team around who used to carry offenses. She's building one around who can disappear into a role and still dominate. That's why players like Caitlin Clark are actually safer than people think, because her gravity works even when she's not scoring. But contrast that with veterans who need rhythm, who need touches early, who need freedom to freelance. In FIBA play, that's a liability. Defenses load up, officials allow more contact, and suddenly efficiency collapses. This is why Lawson's staff isn't asking, "Can you get 20?" They're asking, "Can you impact the game if you get 6 shots?" That question alone disqualifies people. And here's the part fans refuse to accept. Leadership doesn't require dominance. It requires sacrifice. The best international teams thrive because stars willingly shrink their roles to expand the team's ceiling. Lawson is demanding that standard. Which means if a veteran guard can't defend multiple spots and play off the ball and accept reduced usage, there's no justification for keeping them. Not when younger players provide the same scoring with better legs and fewer demands. This is why the guard logjam had to be cut brutally. 4 guards. That's it. Anything more is fear-based selection. And fear has been Team USA's real weakness, not talent. Fear of backlash. Fear of headlines. Fear of cutting someone important. Lawson isn't afraid. She's already seen what happens when you cling to reputation. You get slower. You get predictable. You get hunted. So when fans ask, how could she leave that player off? The real answer is simple. Because that player represents an old version of basketball that no longer survives at the highest level. But now comes the hardest part. Because making these cuts doesn't just affect the roster. It changes the identity of Team USA. It redefines who this program is for and who it's willing to move on from. This isn't just a roster change. It's a warning shot to the entire USA basketball pipeline. What Kara Lawson is doing right now signals something far bigger than who gets cut this cycle. It tells every player, agent, and coach one brutal truth. Past loyalty no longer guarantees future access. And that single shift rewires the culture of Team USA. For years, the unwritten rule was simple. Break in once and you're protected. Make one Olympic roster and the next one leans your way. That created comfort. Comfort created complacency. And complacency slowly dulled the edge of a program that used to terrify opponents before tip-off. Lawson is killing that comfort. In today's USA basketball news, younger players are watching closely. Not with fear, but with opportunity. Because for the first time in a long time, the message is clear. Produce now or move aside. Not wait your turn. Not respect the hierarchy. Just performance. That's huge. It means college stars, young WNBA standouts, and rising two-way wings now know they don't have to wait a decade for political clearance. If they fit, if they defend, if they adapt, they're in the conversation immediately. And that scares the old guard. Because once that door opens, it never closes again. The moment Team USA proves it will cut veterans for fit, every future selection becomes ruthless by default. No more ceremonial invites. No more legacy spots. That's how dynasties stay alive. This also explains why the backlash is already forming. Not because the decisions are wrong, but because they're irreversible. You can't unsee the logic once it works. And if this roster dominates, the old arguments die forever. No Olympic experience stops being an excuse. Too young stops being relevant. She hasn't paid her dues becomes meaningless. Only impact survives. And let's be honest, this was inevitable. The women's game has evolved too fast. Skill gaps closed. Shooting range expanded. Pace exploded. If Team USA didn't modernize now, they'd still win some games, but they'd bleed margins. And margins are where gold medals are lost. Lawson understands something crucial. International dominance is about removing weak links, not stacking stars. That's why this roster feels leaner, meaner, less sentimental, and more dangerous. But here's the part nobody's talking about. This decision also puts massive pressure on the players who do make the team. There are no safety nets anymore. No automatic returns. Every cycle becomes a re-audition. And that changes how players train, how they play, and how they approach their roles. The jersey stops being a reward. It becomes a contract, renewed only by performance. And that's exactly how elite programs stay elite. But we're not done yet. The loudest argument you're hearing right now is also the most dishonest one. Scroll through the reactions. Turn on the debates. Read the headlines in USA Basketball News. They all push the same narrative. This is about disrespecting veterans or overhyping youth. That framing is lazy, and it's hiding the real story. This isn't youth versus experience. It's adaptability versus stagnation. Media loves conflict, so they simplify it into generations fighting for spots. That's nonsense. Kara Lawson didn't choose young players because they're young. She chose functional players because international basketball punishes dysfunction immediately. And here's what's conveniently ignored. Several veterans are perfectly safe. Why? Because they adapted. They changed roles. They defended harder. They stopped needing touches to feel valuable. Those players survived the cut. The ones in danger are the veterans who didn't evolve. And that's an uncomfortable truth no highlight package can hide. This is why the conversation keeps circling Caitlin Clark, even though she's not the controversy anymore. She's the distraction. Fans argue about whether she deserves a spot while ignoring that her inclusion already ended the old selection logic. Once Clark is in, the dominoes fall automatically. 4 guards, finite minutes, finite roles. So when the media frames this as Clark versus the veterans, they're dodging the real casualty, redundancy. Team USA finally admitted it doesn't need 6 versions of the same player. That's the cut no one wants to say out loud. Because redundancy exposes favoritism. It forces hard comparisons. It makes you justify why player A stays while player B, who does the same things but slower, gets protected. Lawson refused to play that game. And here's the brutal part. If you can't clearly explain why a player belongs, they don't belong. Not on this roster. Not in this era. This is why fans feel uneasy but can't quite articulate why. They sense a shift but keep blaming personalities instead of principles. It's easier to argue names than to accept that the entire evaluation system just changed. But inside USA basketball, the conversation is already past that. They're talking matchups. They're talking switchability. They're talking late-game lineups against elite international wings. And when you view the roster through that lens, the cuts stop being shocking. They become obvious. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable realization yet. There's a player who fans assume was snubbed, when in reality she failed the new test entirely, and that test had nothing to do with talent. The player everyone says was snubbed didn't fail because of talent. She failed because of translation. This is the part of USA basketball news most fans don't understand, and it's why so many reactions miss the point. Dominance in one environment does not guarantee dominance in another. Kara Lawson isn't evaluating who looks best in the WNBA. She's evaluating who translates to FIBA basketball under pressure. That's a completely different test. FIBA spacing is tighter. Refs allow more contact. Defenses load faster. And there's less room to freelance. So Lawson's staff asked a brutal set of questions. Does your scoring survive physicality? Can you defend without reaching? Can you play without the ball for long stretches? Can you switch and recover without help? If your game relies on space, whistles, or rhythm, you're vulnerable. This is where the snubbed narrative collapses. Some players put up numbers because systems feed them, because whistles protect them, because defenses can't sit in gaps the same way internationally. Strip those advantages away and efficiency plummets. Lawson knows this. That's why box scores were secondary. Film was everything. Who keeps their balance through contact? Who still makes the right read when the first option is taken away? Who doesn't panic when the game gets ugly? Those answers decided the roster. And this is where fans get uncomfortable, because the players who translate best aren't always the flashiest. They're the ones doing the boring things at elite levels. Rotating early, tagging rollers, making the extra pass, staying connected defensively. International tournaments are won by discipline, not highlights. This is also why Paige Bueckers remains intriguing despite injury history. Her game travels. It's efficient. It's scalable. She doesn't need control to contribute. She adds without subtracting. That trait is priceless. Now contrast that with players whose impact collapses when they aren't the focal point. When defenses take away their first move. When whistles go silent. Those players don't just struggle, they become liabilities. And Lawson won't carry liabilities. Not when every possession matters. Not when one weak defender gets hunted relentlessly. Not when a single missed rotation can swing a medal game. So when people say, how could she leave her off? The real answer is simple, because her game didn't survive the translation test. And here's the uncomfortable kicker. Once that test becomes standard, it won't just affect this roster. It will reshape how players develop from the ground up. Coaches will train for adaptability. Players will chase versatility. The entire pipeline will shift. Which brings us to the moment everything becomes unavoidable. This is the lineup nobody wants to talk about, because once you see it, you understand why certain names had to go. Kara Lawson isn't assembling a best players roster. She's building a problem-solving lineup. One that removes exploitable weaknesses and forces international teams to defend every inch of the floor for 40 minutes. Look at the structure. At the point, Caitlin Clark doesn't just run offense, she bends geometry. Defenses can't load the paint. They can't help aggressively. One step too far and it's 3 points. That alone stretches international schemes to their breaking point. At the 2, Jackie Young gives you power and discipline. She can guard up. She can slash. She doesn't hijack possessions. She's insurance against chaos. On the wing, Kalia Copper is pure disruption. She turns games ugly, in a good way. Transition pressure. Physical defense. Relentless pace. International teams hate players like her because they never get comfortable. Inside, Aaliyah Boston anchors without slowing anything down. She screens, rolls, finishes, and protects the rim without demanding post-ups. That keeps the offense flowing instead of freezing. Now add a flexible fourth, someone who can switch, rebound, and hit enough shots to stay honest, and suddenly you have a lineup with 0 hiding spots. That's the goal. Every player can defend. Every player can move without the ball. Every player can survive being targeted. This is what fans miss when they argue about cuts. They're thinking in isolation. Lawson is thinking in combinations. 5-player units. Late-game lineups. Matchups against teams who will run the same action until you crack. And here's why this version of Team USA is terrifying. There's no weak defender to hunt. No ball stopper to trap. No slow-footed big to drag into space. International teams live off exploiting one flaw. Lawson just removed them all. This is also why the roster feels less flashy. Flash is easy to scout. Discipline isn't. You can prepare for stars. You struggle against teams that don't make mistakes. And make no mistake, this roster is built to suffocate. Now here's the uncomfortable realization fans aren't ready for. If this version of Team USA dominates, there's no going back. The argument for legacy selections dies. The safety net disappears. And future stars will be judged not on popularity, but on adaptability. That's terrifying for some players, and liberating for others. Because the door is now open for anyone who fits the system, not just those with the right resume. But we're not at the end yet. Because dominance creates a new problem: pressure, expectations, scrutiny. And one final decision that could define Kara Lawson's legacy as a coach. Here's the part nobody wants to say out loud: Kara Lawson just put her entire reputation on the line. When you cut veterans, you don't just cut players. You cut protection. You remove excuses. You remove the built-in defense of "we trusted" experience. Now every win is expected, and every loss is personal. That's the risk sitting at the center of this USA basketball news storm. Because if this roster dominates, Lawson looks like a visionary. But if it stumbles even once, critics won't talk tactics. They'll talk disrespect. They'll talk ego. They'll talk about who wasn't there. That's the price of leadership. And Lawson knows it. She's betting that modern basketball intelligence beats nostalgia. She's betting that adaptability beats seniority. She's betting that a lean, switchable, disciplined roster will outperform a star-stacked but flawed one when pressure peaks. But here's where it gets dangerous. International tournaments don't forgive mistakes. One cold shooting night. One whistle-heavy quarter. One bad matchup. That's all it takes to fuel a narrative that she overthought it. And the critics are waiting. They're not watching to see if Team USA wins. They're watching to see how. If Clark struggles, they'll say she was rushed. If a veteran-less lineup gets bullied physically, they'll say experience mattered. If a close game goes sideways, they'll resurrect every name that didn't make the roster. That's the reality of bold decisions. But here's why Lawson still made the call. Because the alternative was worse. Playing it safe would have delayed the inevitable. It would have pushed the problem to the next cycle. And eventually, Team USA would lose, not because they lacked talent, but because they refused to evolve. Lawson chose controlled risk over slow decay. And that's what separates caretakers from architects. She's not guarding the past. She's building the future under fire. This is also why the players who made the roster carry more responsibility than ever. There's no "we'll fix it next Olympics." There's no veteran shield to hide behind. This group represents a new standard, and they'll be judged as such. Every possession will be evaluated. Every lineup choice scrutinized. Every close game dissected. And if they succeed, the entire women's basketball landscape shifts. Selection politics weaken. Development priorities change. Versatility becomes the currency. The jersey becomes earned, not inherited. That's the real gamble. Not winning gold, but redefining how gold is pursued. And now we're at the final moment. Because there's one last truth that ties everything together. One conclusion that explains why Kara Lawson didn't hesitate, didn't compromise, and didn't look back, no matter how loud the noise gets. This wasn't about who got cut. It was about what finally got killed. The myth. The myth that Team USA is unbeatable by default. The myth that medals protect you forever. The myth that experience automatically beats evolution. Kara Lawson didn't just make roster decisions, she ended an era. In the world of USA basketball news, this moment will eventually be remembered as the line of separation. Before this, Team USA selected to avoid criticism. After this, Team USA selects to maximize dominance. That's the real shift. For years, the program relied on inertia. Familiar faces, familiar logic. It worked because the talent gap covered structural flaws. But that gap shrank. The margins tightened. And instead of adapting quietly, Lawson chose confrontation. She chose to say, if your game doesn't scale, it doesn't belong here. That's ruthless. That's fair. That's elite. And here's the truth fans need to accept. Some great players were never meant for this version of Team USA. Not because they aren't skilled. Not because they aren't accomplished. But because international basketball doesn't reward individual comfort. It rewards collective pressure. Lawson built a roster that applies pressure everywhere. Pressure on the ball. Pressure on passing lanes. Pressure on weak defenders. Pressure on egos. And most importantly, pressure on the future. From now on, every rising star knows the standard. From now on, every veteran knows nothing is guaranteed. From now on, Team USA isn't a destination, it's a test. That's how dynasties survive modern sports. This cut will sting in the short term. Fans will argue. Media will oversimplify. Social feeds will stay loud. But years from now, when this roster is referenced as the turning point, the moment Team USA modernized before it was forced to, you'll realize this wasn't controversial. It was necessary. Because dominance doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes when you refuse to change. Kara Lawson saw the erosion forming and chose to act while Team USA still had leverage. While they could control the transition instead of reacting to humiliation. That's leadership. So when people ask, who got cut from Team USA? They're asking the wrong question. The real answer is, complacency got cut. Entitlement got cut. Legacy without adaptation got cut. And that decision may end up being the reason Team USA stays on top for the next decade, while everyone else is still arguing about the past. Now the only question left isn't whether Kara Lawson was right. It's whether anyone else would have been brave enough to do the same.